Lovely. Brilliant. Well, look, again, thank you very much for inviting me to Rewilding Yorkshire. Obviously, I'm completely delighted to be talking to a charity that's so close to my heart. I've been in nature conservation quite a while. I started many years ago, 30 years ago, doing my PhD on peatlands and climate change. And then I got my first job with the Scottish Wildlife Trust, looking at the conservation of raised bogs in a particular type of peatland up in Scotland, of course. And then I was being chief executive of the Sheffield Wildlife Trust, which was mostly about urban nature conservation, the Hampshire and Isle of Wight Wildlife Trust down on the south coast, which was great, fantastic part of the world, but my heart hankered back to Yorkshire, and I eventually turned up back in Yorkshire as the chief executive of the Yorkshire Wildlife Trust for about 13 years. And then eventually, after 25 years with our Wildlife Trust, really felt the need to move on. And I'm going to talk a little bit about that, because there's a kind of personal journey in between all of this about why rewilding is so important to me. So like many of you, I'm a rambler. I love rambling. I'm not from Manchester, I'm from York, but I do get my pleasure the hard moorland way, and I may be a wage slave on Monday, but I'm certainly a free man on Sunday. I won't sing that to you because my voice is rubbish, but it's no wonder that I live in this fantastic county, and I love those sorts of scenes. They're absolutely beautiful to me, and I feel very comfortable in that landscape. But it's a stage bereft of its actors. Where are the ravens? Where are the hen harriers? Where are the merlin, the golden plover, the crane flies? Where are the wooded gills with their pied flycatchers, red squirrels, pine martins, and wood warblers? Where are the people in that picture? The free-ranging cattle that once roamed those fells. So, I look at a picture like that and I feel a sense of frustration. 25 years of nature conservation, and yet I still feel that immense sadness that we're living in a country that is now degraded, one of the most degraded countries on earth in terms of biodiversity. We know the picture, we know we've done the State of Nature reports, 2016, 2019, just published another one in 2023. And it doesn't really matter what graph you look at, what indicator you take, we see the same picture of wildlife decline. For those of us who are old enough, we remember the insects splattered against the windscreen back in the 1970s. That just doesn't happen anymore. Our insects have declined by about 75% since 1970. That is genuinely catastrophic. What is that doing to the food chain? I don't know. We know what the drivers of that wildlife decline are: intensive agriculture, unsustainable development, eutrophication, resource depletion, climate change, and habitat fragmentation. And I can talk on and on about the doom and gloom of nature conservation. And, you can't even prove the counterfactual. I've got much to be proud of over my career. I helped to conserve the Thames Basin heaths when I was down in Hampshire. I helped to develop the marine protected area system out at sea, with the big campaign that culminated in the Marine Act in 2009. Been heavily involved in peatland restoration, green space regeneration, piloting natural flood management, bringing about or trying to start a process to restore Atlantic rainforest, and so on. But yet, despite all of that, so it's difficult to know how much I or the Wildlife Trust or RSPB or National Trust or the National Park authorities have achieved in the face of those massive drivers of wildlife decline. But we're still in a very difficult situation. The international community, of which we're a part of in the Convention of Biological Diversity, has said that we need to bring about 30% of the degraded lands, pretty much all of Britain's degraded. We need to restore 30% of that degraded land, and indeed statutory protect 30%. And when we look at that challenge, we call it the 30 by 30 challenge, 30% by 2030, you can see this map on the left-hand side here. 10% of the UK protected for wildlife through its sites of special scientific interest in Northern Ireland, areas of scientific interest, which sounds quite good. Nowhere near 30%, but sounds quite good. But unfortunately, many of those sites are in really poor condition for wildlife. So that in a place like England, only 3.3% could we say that is protected and in a state that's we could say has been managed well for wildlife. And you can see that much of those degraded areas, if you look at the picture in the center of that diagram, The browner pictures are in our uplands, and quite a lot of it in Yorkshire, of course. But I want to talk about the optimistic stuff, and we'll come on to that, which is why I'm so keen on rewilding. Because it's, despite all that decline, it's not as if we don't even know how to reverse the curve of decline. We know what we need to do. We know we need a nature recovery network, and we're working hard to put that in place. We know we need large landscape recovery areas that drive species diversity and particularly species abundance. We know that in our cities and towns, we need really brilliant green infrastructure or green and blue infrastructure, and a system of development that enhances wildlife rather than destroys wildlife. We know that's possible. Likewise, we can grow food in a way that doesn't destroy wildlife. We choose not to, but we don't have to grow food by throwing pesticides and fertilizers all over the place. We can grow food, as the RSPB has shown at Hope Farm, as pastoral farming has shown in places like Ennerdale. We can have a system of agriculture that enhances wildlife rather than destroys wildlife. We know that out at sea, if we had roughly 30% of our seas as highly protected marine areas where you could no longer fish and you could no longer put wind farms in and cables in and all the rest of it, that actually wildlife would explode and explode within a generation. The science is really clear of that, which would actually increase the fishing industry, not decrease the fishing industry. And we know that, and this is why it's so important that we have organisations like Rewilding Yorkshire. And we know that if 1 in 4 people are interested in nature conservation or rewilding or whatever you want to call it, we can build an unstoppable momentum that simply can't be stopped. And we're not quite there at 1 in 4, but we're not far off. And yet for me, working at the Wildlife Trust, I had a sense that despite all of that action, despite all of that policy work, despite our detailed scientific understanding of what we needed to do, there's a sense that somehow we hadn't quite got it right. If I talk to some of my staff, they would talk about weed wiping, because we were managing fantastic hay meadows. We'd want to remove weeds for making the hay. But the idea, the even concept of a weed in a nature conservation organisation didn't feel right. If we wanted to look after our heathlands, we would treat the stumps with herbicides to make sure that they didn't recoppice. And again, putting pesticides, putting poisons onto nature reserves felt somewhat wrong. We put bird hides all over our nature reserves, pretty ugly buildings, frankly, and very exclusive, just for a very small part of the people that visit our nature reserves in those bird hides. And when you go in, especially if you're a child, they all look round at you in silence and shh. I mean, that doesn't feel right. That never felt right at all. Signs on our nature reserves saying no access, conservation area, doesn't feel right again. All for good reason, of course. I mean, of course, we were not doing this for stupid reasons. But for me, the frustration was beginning to build. 13 years at Yorkshire Wildlife Trust, and somehow I felt frustrated. I felt like I wasn't achieving enough. I felt that it was probably time to move on. Time to move on even from my beloved Wildlife Trust, where I've spent the whole of my career working. I needed to rewire the way that my mind was thinking. I needed to rewild. And where could I start? Well, for me, of course, as a peatland person, I'd start in a bog. Life's a bog, in my view. And start from really the beginning of my awakening into nature conservation. Now, there's a really nice story in this right-hand side here. So this is Bolton Fell Moss. It's just off Hadrian's Wall up in Northumberland, or is it in Cumbria? I think it's in Cumbria. And you can see that pattern of 3 layers of sediment, and we're right down at the base of this raised bog. We're about 10 meters down. So if we're roughly a meter of peat accumulating every 1,000 years, we're back about 10,000 years, even a little bit further than that, 12,000 years back, and right at the base of that raised bog. And what we can see is a story of landscape change in those sediments. So the very bottom sediments there, the dark brown sediment, are lake sediments, and organic matter is already, so after the ice retreated, a lake was formed in that retreating ice landscape. And already, although the clays are filling up that lake, already you're getting organic matter pouring into that lake because of the vegetation that's returning to this once barren landscape, once glacially barren landscape, and returning. You can see that. And then suddenly it goes grey again. Suddenly the vegetation completely disappears from the landscape. This is called the Younger Dryas, or the Loch Lomond re-advance. And it's about 12,000 years ago. Glacial times, full glacial times had finished. It had warmed up, and it suddenly went cold again. And then you can see a massive switch back to dense vegetation, very quick, a very clear line there from that grey layer to that black layer. You can even see a tree growing into the now drying out lake at the top there. So that's a birch tree that's been cut through the core, about a 10,000-year-old birch tree there. And it's a story of rapid climate change. If you look at the pollen on that transition from the grey layer to the black layer, you know, what you see is that the pollen has changed over a 500-year period from no vegetation to vegetation of birch and Scots pine and even oak and ash coming in, and so on. If you look at the beetle evidence, you see that because beetles can fly and trees take a bit longer to move as climate changes, the beetle evidence shows that the climate warmed up by about 5 degrees centigrade of warming over just a period of a few decades. What on earth was going on at that time that meant that the UK warmed by 5 degrees? Bear in mind, we've only had 1.5 degrees of warming so far in this so-called Anthropocene. And we're already seeing catastrophic climate impacts happening. Back then, 10,000 years ago, 5 degrees of warming. The climate can change very quickly. It changed into a very benign period, of course, the Holocene that we live in, and that our human civilization has created in. And that climate has been pretty stable all the way up to the last decade or two. So in here is a story of rapid climate change. It's also a story of resilience. So another site that we looked at on Hadrian's Wall was called Fozzie Moss. And when I put the core into there, it got stuck at about 2 meters. I eventually popped through that layer. And when I pulled it up, I found this very obvious clay layer in the middle of the peat bog. So it had been raised bog. It then got completely covered by clay. And then it continued to form a raised bog above that. And that clay layer we dated to the building of Hadrian's Wall. So it was actually the building slurry and rubble that was falling off the wall as it was being built and completely destroying that raised bog. But that raised bog was resilient. It regrew. And there's a real message of hope in stories like that, that nature is really resilient. Now, of course, we've put a lot of effort into destroying our peatland systems. Here's a classic Yorkshire scene, burning our peatlands. It seems unbelievable to me that we would allow our peatlands to be burned. What a crazy thing to do. And as a result of that burning and land drainage and so on, we're seeing massive erosion on our Yorkshire hills. And that's the picture on the right there is just one example of the sort of massive gully erosion that we're seeing in our peatlands. But equally, we can see a tale of restoration in our peatlands. So the picture on the right there is a site called Falshore Moss. It's in Cumbria on just off Morecambe Bay. You can see the limestone crags behind it. It's a really rather gorgeous site. And actually, this raised bog was probably the first peatland that I knowingly visited. I mean, I'd walked across places like Kinder when I was a lad, but not really thought about them as a peat bog. But this place was a geography field trip at Liverpool University in my second year, I think. And I walked through a dense coniferous woodland because at that time, Falshore Moss was covered with exotic conifers, Sitka spruce and lodgepole pine, and the site was dreary. It was dark. There's very, very little wildlife in that site, and the floor of that peat bog was completely dry. There were some hints that it was a peat bog in the ditches around the field edge, around the ride edges. You could see sphagnum moss and things like that. But unless you actually put a core down, and we did that on the field trip, unless you put a core into that bog, you would never have known it was a peat bog. Cumbria Wildlife Trust took the trees off following an experiment that we did back in the 1990s, where we persuaded the Forestry Commission at that time up in Scotland that actually if you took trees off a peatland, maybe that peatland could recover because the peat is the thing that holds the hydrology together. So if you took the trees off, you could get rapid restoration. They didn't think that was possible. We tried it anyway, and it really did recover quite quickly. And look at the recovery at Falshore Moss there with that massive sweep of sphagnum covering over the stumps that are being taken down there. And on the left-hand side, you've seen that slide gradually change there. So that's moors for the future in the southern Yorkshire Pennines. damming up the drains. And you can see that amazing response of the peatland system, moving from that completely dried out, drained bog into a much, much wetter and more natural system. So peatlands give us a tale of destruction and a tale of restoration. So now I'm going to move into Europe and have a look at what lessons we can see over in Europe. And this is a great place to start. So this is the Coa Valley. This is rock art in the Coa Valley. It was only discovered in the 1990s. It's Paleolithic rock art, so it's probably about 6,000 to 7,000 years old, before the dawn of agriculture in Western Europe. And this is the sort of image that started to rewire my thinking, started to re-stimulate my intellectual curiosity in nature conservation, rethink what we're doing. This rock art, as I say, was discovered in the 1990s. And here's a picture, and you can see very clearly here a picture of auroch, wild cattle, that must have been in profusion if those Paleolithic hunter-gatherers were hunting these animals, and they were probably pretty easy to hunt, big, slow, lumbering, massive animals, probably amazing source of food. And in this landscape, you had auroch, you had deer, you had wild boar, you had tarpan or wild horse, mouflon, all being hunted by the Paleolithic communities. And hunting those, of course, would have been lynx, Iberian lynx in that case, and wolves and Iberian bears as well. All of that returning after the glacial times, those keystone species, all of those keystone species working together to give this enormously biodiverse habitat. So here was a habitat down in northern Portugal, absolutely abundant with game. It must have been a Garden of Eden for those people that had come out of Africa and spread across Europe and ended up in the Iberian Peninsula. But we, of course, are also a keystone species. We also have a outsized influence on our environment. And those Homo sapiens sapiens, those Paleolithic hunters, actually hunted most of those species to extinction. So auroch disappeared, extinct, gone forever. Tarpan, extinct, gone forever. Mouflon, not there anymore. Iberian lynx down to very small numbers. Wolves almost extirpated from the Iberian Peninsula. Not all done by Paleolithic men, of course. This has been over a very, very long time. But it's kind of worse than that, because not only did we hunt out all of those keystone species, we then turned the land over to agriculture. And of course, the Mediterranean basin was the breadbasket of the Roman Empire. It's where all of the food that fed the colonial expansion of the Roman Empire came from. So this is a massively important place for the Roman Empire. And as the land was turned over to intensive agriculture, or as intensive as it could be in Roman times, the soils started to erode, to degrade. They lost their nutrients, they lost their forest cover. Eventually, they were only good for sheep and goats, which made the situation worse. The soil degraded to the point where agriculture collapsed. And there's a very strong theory that it was the collapse of arable agriculture in the Mediterranean basin that led to the collapse of the Roman Empire. There's some lessons in that for us. But we continue to degrade that soil through sheep and goats, to the point where actually agriculture in places like North Portugal and central Spain and central Italy, I'm going to talk a little bit about that in Italy as well, actually becomes unviable. No matter how much subsidy you throw at the system, it becomes very, very difficult to eke out an agricultural living on soils as poor and as degraded as the soils that we find in places like northern Portugal. And so we see in the 20th century massive rural depopulation. People no longer trying to eke out, scratch out a living through agriculture in these lands. It's not to say agriculture has been completely abandoned. You can see some of the olive trees still here, but generally the landscape has been abandoned. The villages have collapsed. There's no longer shops and people living in that environment. But there's a counter to that. The counter is that as the land begins to rewild, as nature, because nature is resilient, so as agriculture comes away from that, we begin to see the return of some of those keystone species. So wolves are returning to northern Portugal, probably for the first time for hundreds and hundreds of years. Vultures have rebounded. The scavenger community has rebounded, helped along by humans, of course, but vultures have rewilded. So there's been a wildlife comeback. In fact, there's been a wildlife comeback all across Europe, helped by things like the Habitats Directive, the reduction of persecution of big animals, and this wildlife and this agricultural decline in certain particular areas. And we can start to supplement those that landscape with some of the missing species. So of course we can't return aurochs, but we can return an animal that's pretty similar. So the picture on the left-hand side is called a tauros, and it's a way of using primitive cattle and backbreeding them in a way that gets them very close to the DNA and the physical characteristics of the original aurochs, and a tremendous beast they are. And we've released, Rewilding Portugal has released tauros into some parts of the Coa Valley. Equally, we can use some of the more primitive breeds of horses, these fine horses called Soraya horses, which are a primitive breed in the Iberian Peninsula, and they're acting as the proxy for wild horses or the lost tarpan. And Rewilding Portugal has a vision for how the Coa Valley might look like if we start to rewild the whole of that Coa Valley. And you can see that it's a recreation of that abundant game, of that abundant natural system that we had perhaps back in Paleolithic times. It's not a return to the Paleolithic. We could never do that. It's a renaissance. It's using the pattern of the past to think forward a much, much richer and more prosperous future. And in that more richer and prosperous landscape, we can begin to create a new economy, a new type of rural prosperity, based perhaps not on just farming, although farming would continue in some form, but on things like nature tourism. So here's a lovely example of Star Camp, where they've created a safari-like experience, putting these beautiful tents up under the fantastic dark skies of the Coa Valley. We've seen similar things happening in the Netherlands here. So in the Netherlands, this is, for example, the Melindergewaard, which is part of the Dutch Rhine Delta. In fact, the Netherlands is basically the Rhine Delta. So one of the Rhine Delta rivers, the River Waal, as it runs out of Germany into the Netherlands past Nijmegen, massive flooding problems. So you have enormous floods coming down from the Alps from the spring snowmelt. And sometimes if that coincides with high tides, Netherlands is pretty flat. And the sea and the river can't get out. Maybe that even coincides with heavy rainfall, and you can get some really significant flooding problems. And many communities down those Rhine Delta rivers were flooding particularly bad in the 1980s. And the Dutch authorities looked at this situation and said, well, we can continue to build massive walls in places like Rotterdam, in Amsterdam, and so on. Or we can make room for that stormwater, store that water in the floodplain where the rivers have before been disconnected, rather than people's shops, homes, and offices, which seems a pretty sensible thing to do. Not that we've done that in the UK yet. And here you can see what they've done here is they've actually taken farming off the floodplain. In fact, the state bought farms off the floodplain and swapped it with the farmers there, and allowed that floodplain to be used for flood storage, managing that floodplain cheaply by reintroducing cattle, acting as wild cattle, acting as aurochs, and reintroducing ponies, Exmoor ponies in that case, acting as the original tarpan. And not surprisingly, when you rewild a landscape at that sort of scale, Melindergewaard would take about 3 hours, 4 hours to walk across. It's a fantastic walk, did it in July. If you rewild at that sort of scale, you do get this enormous explosion of wildlife and really some very unusual things. So at low flows through the River Waal, because the corollary of massive floods is low flows and drought, the sandy bottom of the Rhine Delta rivers, the sand blows up onto the floodplain and creates inland dune systems. So completely unexpected wildlife starting to develop in this brand new landscape. And of course, people love it. Of course, an urban population like the Netherlands, like Yorkshire, people love to go to these fantastic landscapes. And so not only did you get an explosion of wildlife, but you get an explosion of cafes, of B&Bs, explosion of pubs, of cycle hire, of boat tours. Local farmers now making more money out of nature tourism or landscape tourism than they ever did out of agriculture. Very interesting. Some of the farmers that were most against this now running B&Bs and camping sites in this exactly the same environment. Incredible. Is there a lesson there for Yorkshire? Well, there is. I mean, if we look at our river valleys, and what have we done to our river valleys? We have, if we take the River Aire as an example, here it is running from Malham all the way down to the Humber. We've embanked the River Aire, so we thought incorrectly, completely incorrectly, that if we embanked the River Aire, we could speed the flow of water from Hilltop Rain to the Humber really, really quickly, and therefore it wouldn't flood. It actually does the opposite. By increasing the flow, we increase the height of the flood wave, and it's the flood wave that floods people's homes and properties, and we see the immense damage caused in things like the Boxing Day floods and so on. So could we take a leaf out of the stuff that's being done in the Coa Valley, or being in Portugal, or being done in the Dutch river valleys, and actually look at a completely different way of managing the River Aire, where we focus on protecting communities, Leeds, and so on, people's homes, people's offices, people's livelihoods, in a way that reconnects the river with the floodplain? Can we manage that newly rewilded floodplain with wild cattle, with elk, with beaver, and I'll come back to beavers, with cattle, using natural flood management techniques? These are the sorts of things that the Yorkshire Wildlife Trust were doing in the Upper Aire to try to reduce that storm surges through the middle of Leeds, and create an access for all within River Aire. Most of the River Aire, like the whole of Yorkshire, is private land that you can't get into. So we can recreate access for all and start to develop a different economy. So for those farm holdings, which are, let's have a look at that. This is an agricultural land classification here. And you can see that apart from the very bottom of the River Aire catchment, where you've got some very fine grade 2, grade 1 agricultural land, and of course we should be growing food there, much of the River Aire is River Aire catchment is grade 4 land, grade 5 land, only being farmed because of land subsidy. So can we change the subsidy system to create a new economy in those river valleys based upon things like nature and landscape tourism? There's 5.5 million people live in Yorkshire, mostly urban, would love to be out in these fantastic rural environments, and actually then protect Leeds and other communities down the River Aire from the sort of dangerous, life-threatening flooding that we've been seeing over the last decade or two. I'm going to go to another one of my rewilding areas that I worked in, the Apennines. Absolutely fantastic environment, very close to Rome, these superb limestone mountains full of beech forests and alpine pastures. Really, really, really gorgeous stuff. And this is a view from one of the villages that we worked in, and you can see this. This is Monte Ganzana Regional Park, and you can see this fantastic forested landscape. Now, if you had sat on that cafe looking over that, it's a pretty nice place to be, looking over that view just 50 years ago, you'd been looking at a very, very different scene, because that landscape was completely bare. There wasn't a tree in that landscape. In fact, there's a picture on the mayor's office wall of Monte Ganzana 50 years ago, and there is literally not a single tree in that picture. The only tree was by the bridge there at the bottom there. So what on earth has happened? Well, of course, it's that rural depopulation process that's going on. And so once again, these soils have been degraded through centuries and centuries of agriculture, further degraded through sheep and goats, to the point where agriculture is simply not viable, even with the very generous subsidies given out by the Common Agricultural Policy and so on. And the landscape has reforested naturally. Again, nature is resilient, phenomenally resilient. The landscape's repopulated, and into that reforested landscape, we see that amazing comeback of wildlife. So this is a landscape that's now full of wolves, some of the highest density wolf populations in Europe, with species like chamois, so mountain goats, and deer returning in good numbers. We also even have a subspecies of European brown bear, the Marscan brown bear, which is a beautiful, beautiful animal. There's only 50 of these left. They're mostly restricted to the Abruzzo Lazio Molise National Park. And what Rewilding Apennines is trying to do is to create bear corridors, is to connect the Abruzzo Lazio Molise National Park to places like Monte Gonzano, through to Sorrento National Park, to Mehela National Park, in order that that marsupial bear population can start to expand to numbers which makes it less critically endangered. Because at 50 individuals, you only have to lose a couple to a road collision or to a hunter or something like that, and you really start to threaten that population. And so we worked on this concept called Be Smart or Bear Smart communities, which we picked up from North America. We're basically trying to do three things. Firstly, we're trying to educate people about bears. Let's not be scared of bears and magnificent animals. It's just fantastic to have that in your environment. Imagine if we had brown bears back in Yorkshire. They used to be here. We need to, of course, protect against bears. You know, bears, they're big animals. They can cause damage, particularly to beehives, which is an important industry in that area. You can electric fence it. You can see the picture on the right-hand side there, and reduce any possibility for human-bear conflict. It's things like managing your rubbish more effectively, so you don't have bears roaming the street trying to open up bins and get in and eat any rubbish that's in there. But much more importantly, that was this third part, which was about creating the opportunities because of the bears. Because although bears are incredibly difficult to see in that landscape, there's hardly any of them. They hibernate through the winter and so on. The very fact that they are there, the very fact that you've got bears in that landscape, that you've got wolves in that landscape, which again are very difficult to see, they're mostly nocturnal. The very fact that you've got wildlife of that quality just 2 hours from Rome, of course, creates an interest, an excitement, a kind of sense of safari when you go out to a place like that. And of course, that generates nature tourism opportunities, landscape tourism opportunities, and all of the things that we saw in those Dutch river valleys, the cafes, the pubs. And so you start to create a new economy in an area where the economy has basically collapsed. Agriculture collapsed maybe decades ago. And with more wildlife in there, with wolves preying on things like deer and stuff, of course, you see that explosion of wildlife because it all starts kicking back in again. The whole system is regenerating itself. So the vultures come back in that particular place. You can see them nesting just across from the village that I was in there. Absolutely fantastic. Be Smart could equally apply to the Aire Valley or any of the Yorkshire River valleys, because one of the lost keystone species in our UK, in our little island, is, of course, beavers. So beavers are pretty abundant across mainland Europe and have been more or less extirpated from the UK. Well, they were completely extirpated from the UK. They've returned deliberately in places like northern Scotland and illegally, but let's be bloody pleased that it's happened. And Derek Gow, I'm sure, would be talking about it last week, or when the last talk was about. And they've returned into places like southwest England and into the Tay Valley and so on. And these are really, really important animals, of course. You know, these animals are ecosystem engineers. They reduce that flood peak because it takes longer for the water to get through those beaver wetlands, the wetlands that the beavers have created. Equally, they hold water up, so they keep a base flow going. And people don't really understand beavers. I mean, I remember when I first talked about beavers coming back to Yorkshire, you know, one of the landowners saying, "Oh my God, we don't want beavers eating all our fish." They don't eat fish. They're vegetarian, of course they are. And fishermen often say, "Oh, we can't have beavers because the dams will stop migratory fish, the trout and salmon, which have already collapsed anyway." But of course, beavers have evolved with migratory fish. Of course they have. And you can fish can get over beaver dams very easily at high flows and so on. So again, we can look at Be Smart, the Bear Smart community concept, and apply that to Beaver Smart communities. So as we bring beavers back to the UK, we're starting that process, we can start to think about how we can educate people, how we can make people aware of beavers and what a fantastic animal to have back in our landscape, what an amazing ecosystem engineer to have back in there. Of course, we need to improve, we need to think about coexistence with beavers. So we need to make sure that we work to resolve any issues. I mean, beavers and canals don't mix. So if beavers get into canals, they need to be translocated. And that's a very straightforward thing to do. They're very easy to catch, the big animals, and we can move them somewhere else. And of course, if your fields have been affected, as this picture shows down on the River Otter, I think it's quite funny that we got beavers on the River Otter. But we need to change our agricultural support system to support impacted farmers. So actually, instead of trying to make money from pastoral agriculture in that particular example, they get support from the government for the beaver wetlands. And we can train up volunteers to deal with any other issues that might arise. And from, of course, the very fact that you've got beavers in that environment, well, of course, people love beavers. They are officially Britain's cuddliest animal. They have the densest amount of fur of any other animal, so they are our cuddliest animal. People do love to see beavers. And on the River Otter, I was down there in the summer. There were hundreds of people walking up and down the River Otter there to see the beaver. They're natural flood managers, and they create habitat for free. So as we bring about the restoration of Yorkshire's habitat, we do need beavers back in the landscape. Here's another example of where I think we learn lessons from mainland Europe. So this is an iconic image of the Dales, but upland hill farming is in desperate trouble. Subsidies are going down, or farm payments are going down, and trade is a kind of slow-moving car crash because of the way it's been set up. But the quota system that's protected lamb and beef farmers in the UK from, for example, New Zealand, Australian and Argentinian beef and lamb will gradually be reduced to zero over the next 10 years, which means those hill farmers that are currently in our Dales landscapes, in our moors landscapes and so on, are in a very, very difficult financial situation, and a financial situation that's already getting worse. We know that already. We do University of Newcastle does research on this every single year. We know that most hill farmers lose money already on their farm businesses. So we need to think about a just transition. What is the just transition for those farming communities in the hill, in the Dales, on the moors? How could we engineer a just transition so that we're not throwing them off the land? We're not going down the central Italian or central Spain, empty Italy type situation. Actually, we keep farmers on the landscape. And we've been doing some work with economists looking at the sweet spot, showing that actually if we reduce the amount of stocking rates on some of these landscapes, you can actually make more profit. That we could make money through afforestation, through carbon taxes, through carbon offset monies, by improving water quality, through recreation and tourism and so on. There's a mix of economy within there that could replace farm subsidy and selling meat from these different environments. So it's not about farm abandonment, but it is about a different type of farming in which wildlife thrives in our national parks. And my God, what are our national parks for but to have thriving wildlife in? And why is it that our national parks are almost as bad inside the national parks as they are outside the national park in terms of the wildlife value? In fact, in many cases in the Yorkshire Dales, they're actually worse. Let me move to another part of Europe that I worked in, or we called it the Amazon of the North, the Oder Delta. What a fantastic place this is. It's on the German-Poland border. It's where the River Odra or the River Oder comes out into the Baltic. It's quite an incredible system. It's a reverse delta. That just sounds bonkers. But when you get these northerly winds, the Baltic, which doesn't really have a tide, actually runs back into the River Oder, creating a reverse delta. So you get this incredible reverse delta system, which takes a little bit to get your head around. It's the most amazing place for birds. I mean, that's just a picture of cormorants. There's actually white-tailed eagles sitting in there, and you can see a white-tailed eagle in the background. I remember one view where I saw 50 white-tailed eagles in one single view. I mean, it's just bird watching nirvana. Absolutely extraordinary wetland. And again, it's full of wildlife that we've just completely lost from the UK. So we have things like wolves, we have elk returning from Poland, we've even got bison coming in from Poland, we have lynx, all coming back into the Oder Delta. Why is it so rich for wildlife? Well, partly because of the geography of the area. It's a delta system, it's a wetland system. Partly because of the Second World War, that actually these areas were, especially on the Poland side, was actually part of Germany. It became part of Poland at the end of the Second World War, and all the Germans were forcibly moved out of the area, and fewer Polish people came in. So it's a pretty low intensity landscape. And on the German side, there's been a lot of effort by Germany NGOs to restore peatland systems and river systems to create this amazing wildlife system. So they're doing things like rewilding the coast, peatland restoration, river restoration, bringing back things like sturgeon, river reprofiling to reconnect the river with the floodplains and so on. So, and as I say, some of these fantastic keystone species coming back into that environment. So again, some real lessons for us about how you can restore wildlife in a way that can restores both the economy of the area, but brings back some of those keystone species. And if there were two keystone species that I would really focus on, one would be elk, which is this fantastic wetland ecosystem engineer, goes alongside the beaver. Again, we should have those in the UK. It's a bit of a confusing name. Often they're called moose. Actually, that's a North American name for elk. So European elk, lovely picture of that. Really, really important keystone species. And the other keystone species that I think is really important is returning to that after decades and decades of peat cutting, especially in communist times. Returning to that landscape is, of course, sphagnum moss, and it's sphagnum moss that restores the peatland systems. And for Yorkshire, that could not be more important. Now, sphagnum is an amazing lower plant, and you can see the structure of the leaf there with these massive haline cells. And these haline cells allow rapid cation exchange. That's a bit of a technical word for getting a lot of nutrient out of a rainwater, which doesn't have a lot of nutrient in, and it acidifies the environment. It also grows from the top of the moss. You can see a picture there of the sphagnum moss, and you can see it grows from the tip or the apices of the sphagnum and dies at the base. And that dying sphagnum dies in a waterlogged layer and therefore doesn't fully decompose, so that sphagnum is a really important peat former. And as the peat forms, it reduces the hydraulic conductivity, so it's very difficult for water to get out of that growing peatland system, and the peat begins to build up over the top of the landscape, domes of peat growing over the landscape. And when I first started working in peatland restoration, it was all about the biodiversity of peatlands, because they are fantastic places for golden plover and adders and all sorts of amazing wildlife. But as we started to study it and think about the carbon in those landscapes, we realized that there was even something maybe even more important about peatlands. Because although peatlands are quite uncommon, they only cover 3% of the world's land surface, they contain twice as much carbon as all of the forests of the globe put together, which cover 20% of the land surface. It's an immensely dense store of carbon, a huge store of carbon. In fact, that carbon store massively increased when the University of Leeds realized that underneath the Congo Basin was another enormous peat bog that had never even been discovered up until about 5 years ago, one of the biggest peat bogs in the world. The store of carbon is so big, it's bigger than the amount of carbon stored in the atmosphere, so that's keeping our planet warm and is now warming our planet. If we were to damage our peat bogs, we would release vast amounts of carbon into the atmosphere and exacerbate climate warming to the point of catastrophe. And of course, we have damaged our peat bogs. We've damaged 50% of our peat bogs across the globe, not least here in Yorkshire, where we're still burning peat bogs. Unbelievable. And we need to restore those peatlands. So sphagnum's a keystone species for Yorkshire. It's a keystone species for our planet, because it's one of the species that holds the key to locking that carbon back out of the atmosphere into the peatlands as part of the Gaia system. Not only that, is that natural peatlands are rough, so they hold back storm flows, reduce flooding downstream, and they produce easy to treat drinking. If they're not damaged, they produce easy to treat drinking water, which is why the Victorian engineers put the reservoirs up onto the Pennines, where the water was clean and easy to treat for us to drink. And 70% of our drinking water across the whole of the UK comes from peat-dominated catchments. And what have we done? The water companies have allowed those peatland catchments to be drained, to be burnt, to the point where actually they've become, the water coming off there is full of organic matter. And that organic matter, if you add chlorine to it, is a massive carcinogen. So you have to spend a fortune taking that organic matter out. What utter madness have we done? But we can reverse that through this keystone species called sphagnum. Oh, what's it doing? I don't need any of that. Excuse me, I'll just sort this out. Okay. And we are taking that forward here in Yorkshire. This is a slightly out of date slide. This is the Yorkshire Peak Partnership back in 2018. You can see it's an enormous restoration programme going on, being headed up by the Yorkshire Wildlife Trust and through the IUCN UK Peatland Programme and its Peatland Code. And we really are close now to seeing the days of grouse shooting and of burning, which is a complete anachronism, has got to come. And these systems are far too valuable to burn, of course. In the top left-hand picture, that's a picture from today's Guardian, or was it yesterday's Guardian, announcing a £46 million facility to suck carbon dioxide out from the atmosphere. What a crazy thing to do, because we could just fix our peat bogs much, much cheaper, or plant a tree. These are much, much more simpler. So let's fix the planet to restore the atmosphere, because we know that the planet, the Earth, the place that we live on, is intimately connected. We need to fix Gaia, not build ridiculous carbon suck machines at enormous cost, as we see in that picture there. Let's go to another rewilding area, and this is one of my favourites. And I just want you to picture the scene now. I'm deep in a beech forest, in this beautiful, gorgeous spring forest. The light's dappled through there, and I'm tracking one of Europe's rarest mammals. And I'm tracking strip bark. So I'm tracking the places where this animal has stripped the bark from the trees, really high up. You know, it's all tens of meters up. Great dollops of poo in front of me. Crushed grassed areas as this huge animal has stopped and sat down and had a rest and so on. And there with my heart thudding, really thudding inside of my chest, there at the base of a steep slope, I see the very first wild bison, European bison, in the Southern Carpathians for at least 350 years. Honestly, one of the moments, highlights of my life. Absolutely fantastic to see, and even more remarkable when you think that back in the 1920s, so not that long ago, there were only 27 pairs of bison left in the wild. Only 27 pairs of bison left, and they were so rare at that time. Of course, they were virtually extinct. They were collected up and they were taken into zoos and animal collections for a captive breeding program. And the people that did that had this idea that eventually we would breed enough bison in captivity to allow them to be released back into the wild. I mean, it's a very, very clever future thinking thing to save this animal for extinction. The very first bison were released in places like Belarus and in Białowieża Forest in Poland. And by 2010, we had up to 5,000 animals back in the wild, or that's semi-wild animals back in the wild. And that process of breeding in captivity and then releasing into the wild has continued on. We see more bison herds in places like Poland, in the Netherlands, in Romania, as we have here, and now in Kent. And in the Southern Carpathians, Rewilding Europe worked with WWF Europe, now Rewilding Romania, and started the releasing these magnificent animals back in the wild. So collecting up animals from zoo collections, releasing them. We released about 100 over a 10-year period into the Southern Carpathians, and those bison are breeding. And when I saw those wild bison for the first time, there were calves, the very first calves that have been bred, giving you hope for the future that these species would return. Southern Carpathians, of course, are a staggering landscape, unbroken beech forest and upland alpine meadow across the thousands of miles of the Carpathian Mountains, with low intensity valley bottom agriculture, you know, extraordinary biodiversity, immensely rich, full of wolves, bears, wildcats, wild boar, deer, but missing that keystone species of bison. And bison are really important because they open up the woodland landscape by pushing trees over to browse, by stripping bark and killing trees. So they create a mosaic landscape, a more parkland wooded landscape. And actually the story of the Southern Carpathians is one where we worry about the wildlife, is one actually because the real diversity of the Carpathians is that it's got this mix of open landscapes and also deeply wooded landscapes. And a couple of stories there. So I met this shepherd, you can see a picture of here. He was the last shepherd in the valley. He used to be a shoe repairer in communist times, but after communism fell, nobody needed their shoes fixed. They just went and bought new shoes. And so he's now shepherding the last sheep flock in the valley. And you can see what happens if you stop shepherding. You see on that far bank there is that the trees come in and you lose some of that open ground flora. Another person I met in the Southern Carpathians, which is a real story of Romania. He was the owner of a summer house high up in one of the Alpine meadows. And his father had owned the land in the pre-Second World War period before communist times. The land was all nationalised in communist times, and he went to work in a factory, and he had grown up working in that factory as a factory worker. But after the fall of communism, the nationalised land were re-privatised if they could find the old owners, and he had taken back his farm and rented out the lower farm. This is a transhumance system of animals down the lower farm. They move up to the upper grounds in the summertime, and built a summer house up on his thing, a place to retire in. And he loved the wild. He loved seeing the bison return to this landscape. He loved to see the wild boar. He loved to see the wolves. So there's also a process of land abandonment going on in this environment. And if we can bring back bison and encourage small-scale shepherding and small-scale logging and hunting and so on, then we can create, again, a prosperity within these pretty rural communities. So what we need in these mountains is to maintain a different but prosperous economy, an economy of sustainable hunting, an economy of small-scale logging, an economy of shepherding, an economy that's rich in wildlife, that encourages wildlife and adventure tourism, a forest economy, an agro-agricultural, an agroforest economy. So a very different type of economy in there. And that's exactly what Rewilding Romania is trying to put forward. Now, we don't have anything like that in the UK. We've lost our forest cover. In fact, we're one of the least wooded countries in Europe, and Yorkshire is one of the least wooded counties in the whole of England. So we're particularly in northern Yorkshire and eastern Europe. But we do have some pretty unusual weather. It basically pisses it down in a place like Yorkshire. And there's very few places on earth where the weather is as bad in the summer as it is in the winter. And so we're blessed with this incredibly oceanic, amazing weather. And it leads to some fabulous habitats, not least the blanket bogs that I've been talking about. But it also creates a very, very special woodland habitat. It's temperate rainforest. And this is extraordinary. And you do get temperate rainforest here in Yorkshire. So this is some of the most diverse communities that we have in Northwest Europe, and we have them here in Yorkshire, and we have the highest plant diversity. Actually, it's a lower plant diversity of lichen, mosses, and ferns. And you can see in this scene here that the rocks are covered with lichens and mosses and ferns, and it's dripping off the trees and so on. This is really extraordinary wildlife. I mean, feast your eyes on the diversity of this wildlife. Look at those wood warblers, those pied flycatchers, those weird lichens, the mushrooms and so on. Absolutely fantastic, but almost entirely lost. You can see where it would have been. This is a UK temperate rainforest zone. That's where we would have had that forest environment. Extends into Western Yorkshire, and here's a map of that part of Western Yorkshire, or part of that part of Western Yorkshire. You can see just tiny fragments of that remain, but in the landscape there are ghost forest places where, if we look carefully, we can see the remnants of that Atlantic rainforest, our rainforest, the Yorkshire rainforest, the bluebell covered hills, the bracken infested hillsides. These are the places, these are forest soils devoid of their forest, but we could return forest to that environment, particularly as agriculture, pastoral agriculture, begins to collapse through coming out of the common agricultural policy and so on. And so what we've done with Aviva, this is an insurance company, they've given us £40 million. It's an awful lot of money, and we're acquiring nearly 2,000 hectares of land over the next 6 years, including in Yorkshire, using existing woodland grant schemes to develop new Atlantic rainforest habitat. Now, that will take a long time, hundreds of years, but we can, in the Wildlife Trust, maintain those new Atlantic rainforests in perpetuity. That's what we're here for. And we're using the Woodland Carbon Code to assess and verify the carbon that's coming out, that's been absorbed from the atmosphere into those new forests. We're turning them into carbon credits, give those carbon credits to Aviva to retire so that they're completely taken out of the system. So on the one hand, this is a transactional offsetting scheme. I do worry about things like offsetting, but actually that's not really the heart of the agreement. The heart of the agreement is that we are creating new wildlife trust nature reserves, and wildlife trust nature reserves have an enormous number of co-benefits. These are places for all, not for an exclusive few, not for the odd bird watcher or the clever naturalist. These are places for everybody to enjoy. It's part of our charitable service. These are the places where you can get that fix, your nature fix, and they're a natural health service. They're a way of reducing flood management. They give us all those other co-benefits, that quality of life, the backdrop for the nature and activity tourism that I've been talking about, the places to show regenerative farming and agroforestry, reinforce cultural dimensions, and so on. So this is part of the just transition. This creation of nature reserves within these upland landscapes that we've got here in the Yorkshire is part of that just transition, because we're showing a way forward, trying to develop that way forward, just as relevant here in upland Yorkshire as it is in the Romanian Carpathians. And is it possible to conceive of the restoration of the whole of the Atlantic rainforest system across the western part of England? I mean, it seems sort of an unbelievable dream, but this is a place that I worked in for 3 summers when I was a student, working on an outdoor activity centre camp in Maryland. This is the Appalachian Mountains. And it was a fantastic place to spend your student summers in, taking kids out camping and all the rest of it. This beautiful wooded landscape and these gorgeous Appalachian hills. In fact, if I had been there in 1930 standing on that rock, there would hardly have been a tree in front of me, an entirely deforested landscape. And under the New Deal, Roosevelt's New Deal, and they decided to reforest the Appalachian Mountains. And they forested the whole lot. So the Appalachian Way now, a 1,000-mile trail, runs from the northern part of the Appalachians right through to the south. You're effectively in a green tunnel. It's a pretty boring walk, actually. If we can redevelop the Appalachian Mountains in Costa Rica in the 1980s, only 20% of the country was afforested. Today it's 80% or 60%, I think. If we can do that in places like the Appalachian Mountains, we can do that in places like Costa Rica, then surely we can do that in the rich and well-developed country that we live. We can bring the Atlantic rainforest back. And that, of course, is the story of rewilding, about rewilding to restore ecosystem health to our country. We know the science of rewilding. We know that actually if we build that nature net that allows wildlife to move, allows dispersal to happen, if we build big enough areas of habitat, that the random processes of rewilding, whether that be sand dunes developing in the River Rhine floodplain, or dead wood, or bison pushing over trees, or whatever, if we rebuild the food web complexity, we have new and extremely powerful tools to restore wildlife to this county of Yorkshire. It's really, really possible, but much, much more than that. Rewilding is about so much more. It's about these, and we've tried to pull these together in a set of principles here in Rewilding Europe. It's a message of hope, not despair. So this is about optimistic thinking. This is about a narrative of human prosperity based upon natural solutions that we know really work. It's a vision that ignites the passion of people, all of the people listening here today, I hope, and especially of young people. And I've really noticed that rewilding is particularly, it really builds a connection with young people. And if we talk about getting to that 1 in 4, that unstoppable momentum for the restoration of our earth, we do need to bring young people along with it. And it doesn't matter where you are, you know, Rewilding Ukraine is still doing this. Even in the middle of the war, it's still rewilding the Danube Delta. It's bringing back things like water buffalo. It's bringing back hanging ponies, because we know that when the war is over, and the war will be over eventually, that we will rebuild a fantastic rural economy based upon nature tourism in this incredible landscape that Rewilding Europe has recreated, or Rewilding Ukraine has recreated, even in the midst of bombs raining down around them. I'm going to give you one more lesson from the past to wrap up. I've just lost it. Give me 2 seconds. I'm going to move to a place called Tikal. This is in Guatemala, and I had the great fortune to visit this place back in, I think, 1988. Shows how old I was when I was a student. I actually went back there last year, and it's just the most fabulous place, because it's this incredible archaeology, but it's surrounded by tropical rainforest with, you know, granola monkeys screaming away, toucans, It's just a magical place, parrots flying around and so on. But Tikal actually is a ceremonial centre of a massive city, a city that contained 500,000 people. So we're just looking at the kind of York Minster part of what was a city bigger than York, more like, I guess, Leeds or something like that. And to sustain that city, of course, surrounding it would have been a huge agricultural area. So there wouldn't have been tropical rainforest around this. It would have been a huge agricultural area. And that land was over-farmed. The soil started to degrade. The civilization collapsed and wildlife returned. So nature conservation or rewilding isn't really actually about wildlife, because wildlife is resilient. Wildlife will return into these degraded landscapes eventually. It's more about us, and I'll end that talk there. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Rob. That's brilliant. It's especially nice to hear the focus on creating opportunities and the positives that we can get to through rewilding. There are loads of questions. We're running on a bit for time, but I think people will bear with us. I'll start mainly with the questions that people have put in the Q&A, because those that of you have put them in the chat, it's hard for me to split questions just from the commentary. But a couple of questions on sort of regen agriculture and affordable food. Can they go hand in hand?
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. I mean,
food?
Yeah, absolutely, they can go hand in hand. And there's a couple of great examples of this. So we've seen in Hope Farm, which is a farm that the RSPB run, it's an arable farm, and we can see that they have increased production at the same time as increasing the amount of wildlife on that farm. So we can see that actually by tweaking the way that you farm, actually you can enhance wildlife and increase food production. And I think food production is changing anyway. So we're seeing many new techniques of farming. So there's no doubt that we can maintain food supplies and restore wildlife. Now, 20% of the UK is on such poor agricultural soils, it only produces 3% of our calories. So we've got to question whether that's a sensible thing to do. You know, 80% of the landscape is farmed. Do we really need to farm 80% of the landscape when actually 20% of that is producing almost nothing? It really is, it's a completely subsidized system as well. So it really doesn't make sense. So actually what we could do is, they call it sustainable intensification. So I think we could sustainably intensify some of our best soils for sure. We can also think about actually moving some of that production into factories. So we can, because most of the arable land is producing bulk commodities that are used in processed food, which is actually really bad for us. And then there's a way of then decreasing or rewilding some of that land that actually is producing very little food currently. So we can absolutely have our cake and eat it.
Thank you. Going to some of the examples that you gave in the talk, Malingavad, when it does flood, do the animals that were on the floodplain manage to move to higher ground? Is it?
Yeah, it's a very good it's a very good system. So what they've done is they've so of course the floodplain floods, but actually they have higher ground for the animals as well. So the animals can then move out of the flooded plain onto the higher grounds, often the flood banks themselves actually. It's because it's a completely open landscape. So it's not divided up into loads of small fenced fields. It's a completely open landscape. So the animals learn their landscape and they learn where they need to move as water levels go up and down. So yeah, it's pretty well devised. Of course it is. It's the Dutch, you know, they organise everything.
Sure. Turning to beavers, there are a few places now in Yorkshire with licences to reintroduce them, but the cost of the fencing is always a barrier. I don't think there's really any sign that a government is about to decide to allow wild release. So are there sources of funding for people to get for fencing?
Yeah, look, I think we've got to move away from enclosed beaver releases. This is, you know, it's really fantastic that we've done a whole load of enclosed beaver releases, because what we've done is we've proved that bringing beavers back into the British countryside is like just an amazing thing to do. So we've proved the science. We've shown that it can, massively change a system. We've shown the natural flood management benefits. We've shown the water quality benefits. But beaver enclosures is just is a temporary solution. What we've got to get to is free living beavers. So I think we've got to challenge the government. The government has set out in international convention that we want to restore wildlife. The government gave a manifesto promise that it would leave the environment in a better state than it released it. The government put in place protection for beavers and a licensing regime for beavers. And I do not understand why the current Secretary of State, and we don't know about this brand new one, but Therese Coffey, she's just gone, took against beavers. No idea, because it's completely contrary to government policy. One might think she'd been nobbled by the NFU, who knows? But, that's completely contrary to government policy, completely contrary to the manifesto promises, completely contrary to public opinion. It's time to stop all of that. So what we're going to do in the Wildlife Trust is that we aim to do multiple parallel free living beaver license applications. We hope to put those in place by the end of 24, and we'll be challenging the government to get those licenses through. And if they don't get through, we'll be talking very closely to the next government.
Okay, thank you. Still leaves a dilemma for those itching to get on with it now and going, do we spend the money or wait? But understood. Thinking about urban contexts, is rewilding an appropriate or relevant term there? What should local authorities and community groups be looking at for urban wilding?
Yeah, I think it is an appropriate term because rewilding is a continuum. So, the way that we think about rewilding in Rewilding Europe is a continuum from, a completely artificial, concrete car park or whatever, right through to a genuine wilderness. And I think you'd struggle to find a genuine wilderness on this earth now, maybe Antarctica. And actually, there's a continuum that runs right through there. So it doesn't really matter where you are on that continuum, you can rewild. So, for example, if you just put a window box on the side of your flat, you're rewilding your flat because suddenly that flat is now more biodiverse than it was. If we put a green roof on an urban building, we're rewilding the green roofs of that city. That's a really important rewilding mechanism. If we stop gang mowing our parks where it's not necessary, of course, we're going to gang mow in a few places, but if we stop this kind of, complete gang mowing of our parks and allow the flowers and the grasses to grow long every year, we're massively rewilding the park because we're reintroducing natural processes. If we're a little bit less crazy about health and safety and insurance premiums on our street trees and allowed a few street trees to die naturally and have dead wood in our urban environment, that's a massive win for nature, because the three drivers of urban nature, as the Biodiversity in Urban Gardens project showed in Sheffield back in the 2000s, are structural diversity. So we need more trees and shrubs and things, is wetlands. Actually, Sheffield itself has more ponds inside urban Sheffield than there is in the whole of rural Yorkshire. So it's a disaggregated wetland complex, and dead wood. They're the three big drivers that we could put in. So if we wanted to rewild our cities, it's pretty easy actually. So let's just get on with it. Let's rewild our gardens. Let's get local authorities to rewild the green spaces. So let's get, at the moment we're reducing the number of street trees, not increasing the number of street trees. Let's get our street trees back again. Let's get back to what our Victorian parks were actually about, which is about encapsulated countryside, not these gang-mown, boring football pitches and so on. So yeah, absolutely important in our urban environment.
Clearly, there's a lot of influence from both local and national politicians. Do you have a hope that if there is a change of government in the next year or so, it may be different? Do you engage with shadow ministers?
Yeah, we're certainly engaging with the Labour Party and the Liberal Democrats from the Wildlife Trust. So we have a policy team that works centrally with me, and we're talking to all three parties, because of course, who knows what's going to be the complexion of the next government. It might well be a coalition. So it's important that we engage, and we talk to the Conservative Party partly because they're in power at the moment, and if they do end up losing the next election, they're going to be the Majesty's opposition, and opposition is really important as well. So, and we also talk to the Lords. So yeah, we're engaged with all of those. I think our impression of the Labour Party is that they had not really thought too much about nature up until fairly recently. They've changed their Shadow Secretary of State for the Environment, and the new one seems a lot more engaged on the nature thing. Obviously, on the climate agenda, they're pretty progressive. We've had Miliband, one of our Yorkshire MPs, who's been pretty progressive in terms of the climate agenda. But they need to realise that the nature and climate emergencies are inextricably linked. You can't solve one without solving the other. So, it's really important to get the nature stuff right. And if there's one thing that Labour could do, and I'd really urge Labour MPs to get on with this, is to get back on track with agricultural reform. Because the agricultural reforms that actually Michael Gove put out were really good, actually, and they've been completely knackered under the last Secretary of State. So it'd be fantastic to see that move forward.
Separate one. If anyone is looking to work in rewilding in Yorkshire, how should they start out? What should they do?
Yeah, well, I think there's a couple of things. Well, I mean, first, educate yourself, and that's really important. I think there's a lot of rewilding initiatives starting to happen. I would think it's always useful to volunteer on things, so as part of, obviously you've got to earn money as well, but volunteer on things, get on traineeships if you can. There's a lot more paid traineeships than there used to be. Look at the job adverts, because actually there's a lot more, tons more opportunities in rewilding and nature conservation than there were when I was a lad. So I think there's some great opportunities. And, what we're also seeing is that the leaders in rewilding, bizarrely, I didn't really expect this, but in the UK are the private estates. So there are many private estates. I know there's a few on this call. There's many private estates that are rewilding, and what Rewilding Britain has shown is that there's more employment on rewilded estates than there were on the original unrewilded estates. So actually, employment's increasing on there. So there's job opportunities coming out. So I would say just get involved, get your face shown. I think the jobs will come, and they're increasing.
I'm going to abuse my position asking the questions to ask the last one before we must stop. There are quite a few more, and apologies to people if we haven't got to yours, but I have tried to cover a range of subjects with Rob, but we're now at 8:45. So my last one, this backdrop is Upper Wharfdale. We have a number of the larger and smaller landholders in the valley already rewilding of various hues, whether it's Nethergill right up at the top at Outer Shore, or Denton, Harewood, Bolton Abbey in various hues. I'd love to see Wharfdale rewilding. How do I start?
Yeah, well, I think there's a whole number of things we need to do in a place like Wharfdale. So firstly, we need to connect up the water picture. So water's a really important part here. So in Wharfdale, we know that we've got some very serious freshwater pollution problems in Lower Wharfdale, and it's not just Yorkshire Water's fault. Actually, 60% of freshwater pollution is through agriculture, not through the water industry. The water industry is only contributing, say, 30%, and there's another 10% from roads and things like that. So there's a huge issue around freshwater pollution. So we need to start to resolve that, and we know that nature restoration will help water quality. Secondly, there's a huge issue around flooding in the River Wharfe. I drive past Tadcaster, look at those football pitches, are always underwater. We had some very serious flooding in places like Tadcaster not that long ago, bridge collapsing and all that kind of stuff. So we need to connect what's happening in Upper Wharfdale, which is where most of the rain falls, to what's happening in the shops and offices and local and houses of people living in Lower Wharfdale. So that's really important, and we really need to work with Environment Agency, internal drainage boards and so on to get that picture right. The third thing we need to look at is agriculture, because most of that landscape that you're looking there is an entirely subsidised agricultural system. Now, I'm not having a go at any individual farmer, absolutely not. I support our farmers 100%, but I will have a go at the agricultural system that is supporting those farmers to do the wrong things for the environment. So we're supporting those farmers to intensify production day in, day out, whether it's through grants for slurry management or grants for new milking sheds or grants for this, grants for that. So we've completely knackered our agricultural subsidy system, moved it into this into a system that just supports farmers to increase production. That doesn't make sense in a place like Upper Wharfdale anymore, because there's a much richer, and we've seen all those examples, there's a much richer economy there. So we need to get the subsidy system right, and that's a political decision. That's a straightforwardly political decision. Fourth thing we need to do is to get the National Park Authority governed in a different way. So instead of it being governed for a small number of landowner interests, it's governed for the public benefit. So we need to look at the governance of the national park system, and we need to get governance of the national park in the realms of the public benefit, not private benefit. So it's not about subsidizing private landowners. It's about subsidizing or developing policy and planning guidance and spatial policy and so on for the public benefit. And the public benefit is a much, much wilder environment. So there's policy work, there's practical work, and there's connecting these dots together.
Interestingly, I think there are evidently a lot more cattle appearing in Wharfdale. Probably fewer sheep, but definitely more cattle. So the mix is starting.
It's great. Great to see.
Maybe more material left in the meadows rather than being grazed right down. So I do have some hope. Rob, I could go on, but I think we'd be here for hours and hours, which I might quite enjoy, but I'm not sure everybody else would. We've had nearly 100 people on the webinar, so thank you all for joining. Thanks to Rob for a real translation of the things that can happen at scale and have happened, sometimes over decades, but often shorter periods, to reef a forest, regenerate systems, really see natural processes flourishing. So brilliant to see and think that we can get some of them back here. We do get, especially bird species, moving in. There have been golden eagles from the south of Scotland down as far as Nidderdale, probably wisely turning around and going back at this point, but one day they may stay. So yeah, a lot of hope there. And thanks again, Rob, for such a wide ranging and giving us the benefit of your varied experience, both in Yorkshire and around Europe.